every single one of these has had its period of me staring at the computer and wondering if it's live yet.
It says it is.
Okay, good. So that means that we're live. So thank you to everybody who's joining this evening. So again, my name is Jonathan Cohn. I chair the Issues Committee with Progressive Massachusetts. And tonight we'll be discussing the important issue of what I call pandemic proofing our elections. Given the fact that, as we've seen with some of the kind of elections that have already happened during this period, we need to do a better job of making sure that we can both protect public health and increase democratic participation at the same time, especially as we look to the September and November elections here in Massachusetts and nationally. We'll begin with the round of introductions. I'll give a shout out to my co-host, Zelda, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Zelda MacGregor. I live in Falmouth on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and I'm a political activist. Also a member of the Issues Committee of Progressive Massachusetts. Very happy to be so. And I am a doctor of ethics. So I've been really interested in what we're doing in terms of accessibility and allowing people to access their most important right as a citizen, which is voting.
Awesome, and I'll go in order of my screen. So Quentin Palfrey.
Hey, I'm Quentin Palfrey. I'm the chair of what's called the Voter Protection Corps, which is a network of voter protection experts that works in battleground states all across the country. I've worked on voter protection issues. Now this is my 5th presidential campaign. And so I've had a chance to look at elections in a bunch of different states. I was also on the ballot in 2018 as the Democratic nominee for Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts.
Awesome, and then Kristina.
Hi, I'm Kristina. I am the assistant director at Common Cause, Massachusetts.
Awesome, and then Patrick.
Hi everyone, I'm Patrick Roath. I'm a member of Progressive Massachusetts. I'm the chair of the advisory board for Common Cause Massachusetts, and I'm a lawyer in Boston in my day job.
Awesome. So I'm going to put us onto speaker view now for this, as opposed to gallery view, at least on my end where I'm recording. However, so one thing I wanted to start off with is, so we just had an important court ruling on Friday relating to the upcoming elections on the signature requirements. Many people who are watching this might have either signed for a candidate, tried to figure out how they can collect enough signatures for candidates that they're supporting to get on the ballot, since that's something that's a very difficult thing to do when you can't have in-person voter contact. You can't do door-to-door canvassing to get signatures. You can't go to events. You can't have in-person house parties. So that severely limited candidate abilities, especially candidates who don't already have like a large existing network of people. Patrick, do you want to talk about what that ruling the lawsuit and what the ruling on Friday was?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. So we won, so we're thrilled. So I'm happy to talk about it. And, I'm happy to kind of walk people through the case and what it means for us, like kind of what the upshot is. I'm also happy to talk a little bit about some of the background and some of the behind the scenes stuff, which I think might be interesting to this group. And I think maybe there's a lesson or two about how to take away, how to distill a lesson about how to do advocacy in this super weird time that we're all in. The case itself, you put it right, John. Kristina and I and some others were just working as the crisis started to hit to try and figure out what the thing to do in Massachusetts about voting was. We had these upcoming elections at the local and special level in the spring, and then there's September and there's November, and we were focused on that. We were working on absentee ballot rules and voting by mail, election day registration, of course, which has long been a priority. And then people started to reach out to us, and we started to hear about people who were really worried about the signatures. It's a real hurdle. If you're running for United States Senate, you need 10,000 of them. If you're running for state rep, it's 150, but that can be hard. If say the seat that you just decided to run for only opened up in the last few weeks, and it only opened up after COVID started to really kick in. So we were starting to hear about a lot of issues, and a little bit of the inside baseball backstory that I'll share with folks is that this was really prompted by people who are in the state house, in the power structure, who were like, this will not happen unless there is an outside force compelling it to happen. Because unfortunately, I don't think our system as it exists today is designed to be all that responsive to the needs of people who want to join the system, who want to start to participate, who haven't already, who don't have that pre-existing network of support, who want to join the ballot for the first time. So it was made pretty clear to me that it was not going to move at the State House without litigation. And so we started to think pretty hard about that, tried to organize a group of people who could bring the lawsuit, get the kind of legal support for getting it to court, and start to strategize about what an advocacy strategy around a lawsuit would look like and how we could fix this. And it's crazy, right? Because if you think about, like, when I tell folks who aren't in Massachusetts, who aren't in politics, they're like, of course we should fix the signatures. How could you go get signatures right now? It's absurd. But there was a lot of inertia to overcome at the State House. And I think a lot of that, unfortunately, had to do with the instincts that sitting legislators and officials had to protect their seats. So a lot of back and forth in a very short period of time with the secretary, the legislature, the courts. We ended up getting it to a place, and I'll say that the Secretary of the Commonwealth, as represented by the Attorney General's office, agreed with us on a lot. They ultimately came to a place where they agreed that the rules should change. We just couldn't get it through the legislature in time, so we ended up going to the courts. And the decision on Friday, we think was, we didn't get everything we asked for, but we got most of it. And I think it's the court acknowledged that there is a constitutional problem if the right to vote for people you want to vote for, the right to reach the ballot with like a reasonable, just a reasonable impediment to getting there, was just being so constrained as a result of all the measures that were all taking place right now because of public health, that it was impacting constitutional rights. And the only way to address it was what they did. I'll briefly touch on that because I'm sure people are interested. So basically, for all of the offices, if you're running as a party candidate, it doesn't apply to non-party candidates. So those deadlines are way further out. But for all the offices that are on the ballot this year, it's a 50% just complete haircut on the number of signatures you need to deliver. For the district and the county seats, which have an earlier deadline, it would have been April 28th. That gets pushed out a week to May 5th, which is the same as the federal deadline. And then one more innovation, which is the Supreme Judicial Court ordered the secretary to start accepting electronic signatures. Not like all in, you can just email it in kind of thing, but a limited amount of electronic signature gathering is now going to be permissible. And that's starting to roll out. And the last thing I'll say was just to kind of round this out, and it's the update from today, is that unprompted by any of the parties, today, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts just posted another order, and they ordered the Secretary of the Commonwealth to file a report within the next day about how he is going to implement this and how he's going to construct clear guidance for candidates. Which is pretty proactive, I would say, of them. They are watching this very closely, and they're worried that people's rights are being impacted. I had been fielding calls all weekend from people like, great, we're so glad you guys did this. What does it mean, right? I have no idea what this thing is. This electronic signature has never done it. The secretary had a little bit of stuff on his website. So, we're all evolving really quickly, and we're trying to be really quickly at least. And the court is on top of this one, which is pretty cool to see. So that's my kind of first, high level. I'm happy to dive into anything else if people are interested.
Awesome. Anybody want to chime in with any follow-up points for that or any questions?
I just want to say congratulations to Patrick personally and to Common Cause of Massachusetts for leading this fight. This was a big deal. And at Voter Protection Corps, we pushed for reduction of signature requirements. We pushed for Patrick Kearney's bill, which would have reduced the signatures to 2/3. I heard exactly what Patrick is describing behind the scenes in the legislature, people saying, look, this ain't going to happen unless there's outside pressure. There's not going to be an ordinary legislative route for this. And so it was absolutely necessary to have the external pressure that you all brought to bear. And this was a really important civil rights issue. So it sounds like kind of a wonky thing, but if you think about it, we want first-time candidates. We want progressive candidates. We want candidates of color to be able to enter the system. And the forces that were preventing this from happening without a lawsuit were forces suggesting, well, maybe it's okay for there to be barriers for non-incumbents, and that's not okay. And it was unfortunate that you all needed to take to the courts to vindicate that principle. But groups like Progressive Mass, groups like Common Cause, I think played a really important role in vindicating those important principles. And I think at the end of the day, that's going to mean more progressive candidates and more diverse candidates are going to have an opportunity on the ballot. And that's a win for democracy.
Patrick, sorry, John. Patrick, may I ask a question?
Of course, please.
This is Zelda. I think I heard you said that the Secretary of the Commonwealth agreed with most of what you guys were saying. Can you tell me what the office disagreed with?
Yeah, so we took a strong position, I guess I'd say. We said that court, there's no, you should just not enforce the signature law right now, because who can say what a safe number of signatures to gather right now is, right? I mean, really, it's not clear that there's any number that's okay to go out there and get right now. And, maybe it's too hard to spin up some brand new electronic collection scheme right now. And we said, so that was what we were really saying. That was sort of our first thing, knowing that that was probably too far for the court, but thinking that like, okay, well, that might prompt, if we go up here, then maybe they'll come up to here, like that kind of logic. And then our subsidiary, like our backup to that was, okay, well, if not that, then roughly a third of the time, Canada's had roughly a third of the time that they normally have to go out there and get signatures unimpeded by all the COVID stuff. So why don't we say you only need a third of the signatures that you would ordinarily need? And that's the line that we asked the court to draw. The secretary came in, and the secretary's view was that the court, if it's going to draw those lines, the best line to draw is to look at what the legislature was doing. And the day of our argument, the Senate had engrossed a bill that would have done 50%, but not for the legislative seats. So that is the argument that they presented to the court. The court kind of split that, I guess, because it did 50%, but it did it across everyone, which is the thing that, frankly, we cared most strongly about, that they weren't going to exempt for some reason these two categories of office.
Yeah, which really made no sense from any logical basis for them to say that we should have it for everybody else except for us, because it obviously seemed designed to make it harder for people to run against them, but very few incumbents had even collected enough signatures by that time either. I remember seeing in the State House News Service that maybe a quarter, if that, had actually collected enough signatures to get on the ballot of incumbent legislators. So their desire to protect themselves from challengers that are far too rare in the state from the first place was shooting themselves in the foot at the same time.
Yeah, and it's an interest, and I'm sure Kristina will talk about this when we get to the legislative agenda, but it's a good reminder too that the legislature is not a monolith, right? I had emails after the decision came down from leadership members saying, we were with you, good, we wanted this the whole time. But there are pockets of resistance to some of the, and this is true across the board for our agenda, right? There are pockets of resistance in the legislature to some of the things that we want to do that are just hard to get around, even for people who are with us, right? And this was one of those things.
Kristina, did you come in?
Yeah, I also want to congratulate Patrick, and he, there were a lot of people, it sounds like, who are bringing this up and raising with him and with Common Cause, but Patrick was the one who actually took the initiative on all of this and ran with it, and it just that deserves to be acknowledged. But I think that one of the byproducts of a crisis like this is it shines a different light on any number of barriers to participation, which we should talk about the election day registration and that side of it. But I think one of the things that I responded to, in at least loosely following this court case, was just, which played out really quickly, but I stopped seeing the value of, and maybe this is a question for Patrick, is do you see value in a signature requirement to run for office, or do you see it more now as an arbitrary barrier? Or
yeah, well, I'll tell you, Kristina, some days I pushed to have just, it was my strong conviction that the solution here was just to wipe it off the face of the earth. Now, why do people think that's a bad idea? It is conceivable that you have a ballot at the end of the day that looks like this, right? Like we don't want your state rep ballot to be 30 pages long. We've seen that in Florida intentionally, right? For reasons that Quentin is well aware of, that they try to make them long to make it harder to vote.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a concern about that. But I mean, ask yourself, is the problem in Massachusetts right now that we don't have enough people running for local legislative offices? I don't really see it, right? So, I mean, yes, the state has like there's some quantum of like support that you ought to be able to prove before getting on a ballot. But the numbers they're proportionate in some ways to the importance of the office, or not importance, but the magnitude of the office. But they are arbitrary in a lot of ways. And I think they ought to be reduced. Personally, I just don't think that you need 2,000 to run for Congress, right? I mean, that's a big number, especially when your denominator is low.
10,000 to run for lieutenant governor.
Yeah, right. Quentin knows well.
Just to take a crazy example.
Just to throw one out there. Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit silly. You end up, I mean, the truth of it is you pay for that. Like you just pay for that. It's a cost. It becomes a cost of the campaign, and that's what we saw. I mean, it's a funny thing. This is a bipartisan lawsuit. In a lot of ways, we had two, I would say, progressive Democratic challengers and one Republican. And, those are both political groups that are excluded from like the incumbent power structure right here. And we kind of had common cause around that, which is a strange thing. So long answer, Kristina, but like maybe there's a little bit of that worthwhile, but I don't think it's a big concern here.
Thinking of upcoming things, Kristina, I wanted to ping you on this. So the legislature recently passed a bill to address some kind of, I'll say, pandemic proofing issues for the local elections that happen in the spring, as well as the special elections coming up. Can you tell people a little bit about what happened in that bill?
Yeah. So the short is it allows spring elections to be extended or delayed until June 30th, which is great. It added a definition or a reason to get an absentee ballot. So in Massachusetts, you can only qualify for an absentee ballot if you have a physical disability, you will not be in your city or town, or if you have a religious disagreement. So that puts us in the 1/3 of states that require an excuse for absentee ballots. They added a 4th provision for the spring where any COVID-related excuse means you qualify for an absentee ballot. They also extended the deadline for requesting an early voting by mail ballot, which one of the things that we have in the Commonwealth is the system of early voting by mail, which is I think really good and nice in theory, but it's just not really used, which we can talk more about that later. But together, that means that it will be much easier for voters to participate in elections in the safety of their own homes. So that, that's all great. And I think it's exciting that affirming that that was acted on so quickly, but we are now really turned in full force to our fall elections as well.
And they also shortened the registration deadline too.
Oh, yeah. Oh my gosh, how could I forget? They cut the registration deadline from 20 days to 10 days, which, on the thread of kind of questioning what role deadlines or signature requirements plays. I think that one of the wins in this spring bill was we can now say that there is a precedent in Massachusetts that we don't need a 20-day registration deadline, that is excessively long.
Yeah, because I remember when there was another Supreme Judicial Court case a couple of years ago, although the court upheld the 20-day registration deadline. Actually, the Supreme Judicial Court upheld the deadline, but the Superior Court in Suffolk County had commented that it's clearly arbitrary and not necessary. And if they can so easily move it from 20 days to 10 days, like, why even have one?
Yeah. So, if you want to turn also to fall things, I don't want to jump the gun on that, but I think it is a very low ask to say that the minimum should be that 10-day registration deadline should be replicated for the fall. But as you know, we've been working on election day registration for I've only been working on it for the past year. I know that other advocates and Common Cause has been working on it for far, far longer. But there are many issues that coronavirus poses for elections. And then just starting with registration, I think that is one that I'm particularly worried about. I don't know how, all of the in-person voter registration efforts that are so important, not just for getting new voters into the system, but for helping people update their registration. Those aren't going to take place over the summer. I mean, I think the truth is that even if things are somewhat back to normal in July, people are still going to be crossing the street, and people are still, going to be abiding by a certain amount of physical distancing. And I know I personally wouldn't approach the voter registration table at my grocery store or at the League of Women Voters or Common Cause event. I might not want to answer my door for the person with the clipboard, and I'm going to be a little more hesitant to stand in line at the DMV, which is another site where all of those new registrations and updates happen. I think that there's and not to go on and on, but there's a challenge that advocates face in a moment like this of not seeming like we are taking advantage of a real crisis to push our agenda. But with the case of Election Day registration, this crisis, it shows how we need it. And I think the fact of it revealing kind of the arbitrariness of our registration deadline in the first place, inherently pushes our agenda. But I think that, in some we're pushing for, at the very least, reducing the registration deadline for the fall to 10 days. But our gold standard and that of 21 other states is Election Day registration. And I think that this,
No, finish what you're saying.
That I think in good faith is a policy that we can push and use the coronavirus as an example of why it's so important.
So I'd love to chime in on this and just to reinforce, I think, what Kristina is saying about the importance of focusing on registration issues now. If you think about sort of who gets injured as a result of these barriers to registration, they tend to be people with lower incomes, people who move around a lot, younger people, non-English speakers, and we have, large across the system, huge disparities in terms of the advantages that people who are affluent and who have stable incomes and stable addresses have over younger people, people of color, people who move around a lot. And so if you look at how this manifests itself, it manifests itself as people who show up on election day and they think that they should be allowed to vote. They're not on the rolls. They fill out a provisional ballot. Maybe that's probably not counted. And I think that in the time of coronavirus, those problems are going to be even more severe. So what do you do about that? Well, I think that there are at least three things that we should do. The first and most obvious one is to allow Election Day registration, right? This is, as Kristina said, this is something that's worked very well in 21 states in the District of Columbia. I've personally seen it work very well in New Hampshire. It's administrable, it doesn't have fraud. It's a really very straightforward solution to these problems. A second one is automatic voter registration, and there's good news and bad news. The good news is that Massachusetts finally did pass an automatic voter registration bill behind a number of other states, but it was a big step forward about a year and a half ago. The bad news is that the way that it's being administered in Massachusetts is not consistent with the so a lot of how the advocacy community thought that automatic voter registration was going to work was that it was going to be an opt-out system. In most of those instances, it's now being implemented as an opt-in system, and that creates a very big barrier for a lot of those people. So we should fix that. And then the online voter registration process, again, privileges people who are sort of more institutionalized, right? So you have to have certain documents in order to do online voter registration in Massachusetts that make it harder for some folks to access the system. So if we were to implement election day registration, if we were to reform the automatic voter registration system and fix the online voter registration system, there'd be a lot more access into the system than we already have. And I agree with Kristina, if you're not going to do election day registration, we should shrink as far as possible the cliff that people face. But frankly, I think we should just get rid of that deadline and not tinker with it.
It reminds me that the comments about election day registration remind me of some of the interviews I've done recently, like with folks from MIRA, the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, about how they register new citizens around that. And let's say a lot of those, let's say like new citizenship events where they, like, I'm guessing that those aren't going to, like, probably aren't happening currently. Some of the other like field work that they'd be doing. And I was talking with folks from the Public Higher Education Network of Massachusetts, and all of that work of registering college students, which is so important for getting people, like when they're new to a campus, their address is clearly changed. Because I know that I live near Northeastern in Berkeley. On September 1st, so many people changed their address. And whether they just moved across the street or from like a different city or town, you want to be able to get those people registered. And if you can't have those in-person events, it makes that kind of election day registration all the more important. One question that I saw on Facebook about automatic voter registration is somebody asking about having the unemployment insurance system as a registration agency. Does it currently have that status? I don't know I forget which all agencies fall under that, for at least for the original bill back in at least the original what's the name for the stuff created back in the early 90s, the agencies that have like
the voter?
Yes.
Kristina, we got into the weeds of this when we were starting to implement AVR here in Massachusetts, and Kristina can jump in if I get something wrong, but it's funny, it comes back to this kind of where I started, which is signatures. And the RMV in Massachusetts has your signature on file. So that helps the registration process, right? It means they can automatically register you using that. The other place that has your signature is the state health, Mass Health, right? So they have signatures too. So Massachusetts wanted to be the second state that, I think Oregon does it, you might have even been the first, to bring all those people into who are registered in Mass Health on the same logic of the unemployment agency, which the short answer is I don't think we do right now because they don't have the signatures. We ran into huge federal problems with that around privacy laws that were formalities, but the current administration would not waive the application of those laws to make that happen. So currently, my understanding is that AVR is being implemented at like a glacial sort of half done pace, and only using the RMV data. Is that right, Kristina? I think.
I thought that it was also still implemented via the health connector through Mass Health, but I can also fact check.
Okay, maybe that'd be great if we were. I thought that's where we landed on that one, but but that's those are the two sources of data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd be curious about how many people are even going to the RMV these days.
Yeah, I mean that a number of services aren't even available. And I mean, I know, like if things are back to normal over the summer, there are some transactions that you can't really work around, I guess. But I just think that what we know is that people are going to be thinking about what is essential, and putting off the trip to the RMV until their driver's license is really, really about to expire. And I think Quentin is right that it is a huge equity issue, especially when we talk about who are the populations in Massachusetts who are moving the most frequently. I think that one of our arguments for election day registration for a long time has just been people forget to update their registration, and that doesn't mean you should lose the right to vote and to have your vote counted, which of course, if you have an out-of-date registration, you should be able to cast a provisional. We have heard instances of people getting turned away without provisional ballots. And then we know that like 30% of provisionals in Massachusetts are even counted. And then I also go back to like voting should feel good. And I think that it feels bad when you get there and you're told like, oh, your name's not on here, or your address is wrong, and you're going to need to go talk to, the clerk or whatever in order to cast a provisional. Like, that is an experience that's going to discourage a voter from coming back. With people moving so much more, or the people who are moving are low-income voters, generally college students, young people. I think that now more than ever, saying it's reasonable for updating your voter registration to fall to the bottom of the list, you shouldn't be penalized. That is only multiplied in this instance.
Zelda, were you about to ask a question?
No, I guess I was thinking of one, but I wasn't planning on asking it. But yeah, I just moved in September of this past year, and changing my registration, even though I was already a registered voter in Massachusetts, was wild, because I found that I had to either go to the post office to do it, which was fine for me. I can go to the post office. But doing it online, you had to have your state ID or driver's license. Now, I was waiting for a new ID in the mail, so I couldn't register online. So when I went to the post office, they were like, well, you could just do it online. And I'm like, great, can I have the form, please? And the thing is, a lot of people who are eligible to vote don't have access to the ID that would require them to be allowed to vote online and register online. And they also don't have the time to go to the freaking post office during the hours that they're open. So are we even thinking about, I'm sure you guys are, any kind of way that we can make it more accessible for people just to register now? Because it was difficult just for me to change my registration. I finally went to my clerk's office and did it, but I was able to do that because I work from home.
Mm-hmm. That point reminds me of one thing I remember finding really interesting, about one of the barriers for college students for voting in general was that college students didn't know how to get stamps. Because young people these days, I say that young people, I'm not that old myself, but people younger don't have to do a lot of mailing of things. And so if you're not used to actually having to mail anything, you don't even really think about where you can even get stamps.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. One of the things that dovetails in, part of the conversations that we've been having have been around how do we bolster voter registration efforts in the time of coronavirus. I know that there have been, some activists who've been doubling their efforts to do like social media kind of registration pushes and registration via letter writing and that kind of thing. I do think that there is also more that the Secretary of the Commonwealth could do around mailing registration forms. One of the issues, there are a few that we are really taking up and moving forward on for fall. But I think that there is a greater conversation that could be had, and more that we could probably ask of the Secretary of the Commonwealth, because a lot of our kind of knee-jerk response has been, what can activists do, what can advocates do to make up for this gap in voter registration? And then I think there's sort of this wall that was hit where we said, well, like, actually, is this really the job? Should this be the job of activists and advocates? Yeah.
Quickly, want to transition to another major topic of voting by mail, which has gotten a lot of national attention as well, starting to get more attention in Massachusetts. Before I talk there, quickly want to note, AVR does include Mass Health. I looked it up online just to confirm that. But with voting by mail, we've seen a number of other states move toward that. I know that some states, like California, like Washington State, like Arizona already have a lot of vote by mail. Does anybody want to chime in a little bit about how does that work in other states, and what's the current status of the effort to bring that to Massachusetts?
I'm happy to start, and then Patrick and Quentin, if you want to jump in or if I'm missing things. So the short is there is a range of what kind of falls under the umbrella of vote by mail, and at the very top is what states like Washington have and Hawaii. That's all mail voting. So every eligible voter gets mailed a ballot. They send it in. Washington, at least, counts any ballot that is postmarked election day. So on the one hand, their results can be a little delayed, but it means that anybody who postmarks their ballot is counted. Then on the bottom of the tier is absentee voting, which is what we have. And we are the 1/3 of states that require an excuse. In the middle, there is no excuse absentee voting, where you need to request a ballot, but you don't need an excuse to get one. If anyone else wants to jump in, I don't want to take this whole, but I'm happy to talk about what we're looking to do here in Massachusetts for the fall. So what we have in Massachusetts right now is absentee voting with the 3 excuses. For the fall, we want to replicate the same thing that was passed for the spring, where there's an additional excuse. We have had many conversations about moving to that kind of next tier of no excuse absentee voting, which absolutely is the goal. It would take a constitutional amendment, and that's a 2-year process. So in terms of responding to our fall elections, that's just not, that doesn't make sense. But ensuring that anybody who wants to cast an absentee ballot in the fall can just cite coronavirus and get their ballot and vote from the safety of their own home. There are a number of other kind of more like technical issues that fall under that. We support actually in just mailing absentee ballots to everyone in Massachusetts who's an eligible voter. There are a number of reasons for that. There's an equity lens, just access. I think there's a basic like voter participation angle, but it also could save elections officials a lot of work around dealing with absentee ballot requests, which if we look at what happened in Wisconsin, there were a lot of things going on there. But I think that is a state that in some ways is ahead of Massachusetts on the absentee balloting curve. But they were completely unprepared for the surge in absentee ballot requests, which is why so many people were disenfranchised.
So I think it's important to distinguish. Oh, I'm sorry, John. Go ahead.
No, I was pointing to you on my screen because it looked like you were trying to. It doesn't work in Zoom.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between an all mail-in ballot system and a system that's a combination of an opportunity to vote by mail and an opportunity to vote in person. And I think although there are some states that have done all mail-in voting successfully, I think the optimal strategy for those of us pushing for expanded vote by mail options is to have both. Secondly, I think Kristina mentioned this, but I think it's important not only to mail everybody a ballot, but to allow them to send it back postage free. So we should be shouldering that burden. Congress should have paid for that, and the Democrats pushed for money to support state efforts to expand these efforts. I was on a press conference with Congressman Kennedy and Clark and McGovern and Anna Presley last week, where they're re-pushing for some of this stuff, but we really need the resources to do mail-in voting. We also should make it possible for it to be postmarked by election day. I think this is an important access issue. Also, the signature mismatch issue. I know we were talking a little bit about this, but we really don't want clerks to act as like forensic experts. If you actually talk to people at the FBI, and this has been litigated in the election context, it actually takes about 50 signatures for a forensic expert to be able to match signatures. We really don't want the local clerk or the Secretary of State's office to have the burden of doing those kinds of matching. But I think that what's really important in the time of coronavirus is to be expanding opportunities for votes. We should be thinking of vote by mail as one piece of a comprehensive strategy to overcome the kinds of barriers that the coronavirus pandemic is going to cause, but also that we already had in our system, right? So there were huge numbers of obstacles to registering and voting. And so if you want to overcome both the sort of voter suppression, the systemic differences between, opportunities to vote and these pandemic things, you really have to think beyond one strategy. So we should expand vote by mail. We should dramatically expand early voting. And make a lot of opportunities for people to go into their local town hall and just to vote early. And we should be thinking about how to expand, not contract, the in-person voting opportunities. So it's consistent with social distancing. I know that there's going to be some pressure to shut down some polling places. There are going to be some polling places that are no longer appropriate, and that's fine, right? So we shouldn't be voting in senior centers. But as we're thinking about relocating those, we should make sure that there are more, not fewer options for people. We've seen this really creating some access barriers when you shut down too many polling locations. And then we should also be thinking about poll workers, because a lot of the folks that volunteer at the polls are senior citizens who may be a little bit more apprehensive or may have some public health concerns about participating in our elections in that way. So we should be thinking now how we make sure that there are enough resources to have in-person voting options in addition to vote by mail. We want to vote in that way unless we're in the absolute depth of a second dip COVID outbreak. But if we're not, we actually are going to want some opportunities for folks to vote in person. We don't want it to be what happened in Wisconsin, where, for instance, in Milwaukee, they shut down a ton of those polling places and crammed everybody into a small number of polling locations. And some of those folks actually probably contracted the coronavirus because they exercised their right to vote.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and Common Cause Massachusetts has, and our coalition, and now 50 organizations have signed on to a letter that kind of details a lot of what you hit on, and we absolutely, I think one of the things I've noticed in the national conversation is there's been a little bit of a move towards talking about vote by mail as the catch-all fix, which, the short is that like perfect reform doesn't exist and vote by mail isn't it. It's especially important right now. But we absolutely are working to expand early voting in Massachusetts to ensure that polling places have funding for face masks for poll workers, for gloves for poll workers, for, Purell and all of the rest. And really it's the strange time of thinking about how polling places can implement social distancing or physical distancing safely. A couple of the other points, we support postage prepaid envelopes so that, paying for that postmark or the stamp or even getting a stamp isn't a barrier to the voter who wants to cast a ballot in the mail. And then on the poll worker question, there have been a lot of conversations and the beginnings of some effort to get a lot more young people to work at the polls, possibly combining that with, kind of building on the momentum that the 2018 civics education bill put in place. So encouraging and, maybe finding a structure to get more like high school seniors who are eligible to work at the polls or volunteer at the polls. I know a few campuses have been teaming up with their student voting groups to try and mobilize young people to work at the polls. There are issues there to be hammered out as well, like ensuring that somebody who's registered in one precinct can actually work at a different precinct, so that if you have a glut of volunteers in one area or workers in one area, they can go someplace else. But it absolutely, I think that for a long time, a lot of Common Cause and lawyers for civil rights work has been around elections, around election protection. And I think that we have a little bit of a new charge this time around with working to make sure that polling places are actually staffed. And also not with, the most vulnerable age demographic.
If people wanted to be a poll worker, how do they go about doing that?
You contact your town or your city or town election office. I know I emailed my election commissioner. I should be able to provide easier.
That's basically,
I think that's it.
Your town websites, and they probably have an elections page that should have contact information for people. That's great.
Yeah, and it's this might be it's a 1 hour training, that's all, and then a 16-hour shift, but
but it's for a good cause.
Yeah.
Zelda, it looked like a second ago like you had a question.
It was really just about local election workers. I was going to say that down here on Cape Cod, where literally 100% of our election workers are people who are elderly, that's also our main population. Quentin knows. We are in concern of this. We're in dire straits right now. Some of the elections are going forward immediately, and there's no one to work them. So I was just going to ask if you guys had any suggestions, but you gave us some, contact the high schools, the colleges, whatever. So we can try that. But we're nervous about it because we have we have a special Senate election right now that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And some of our town elections are happening that same date, but we don't have poll workers for them in 6 towns. So that's what I was going to ask about, but you really did already answer it. So thank you.
One of the things I would say, and as I mentioned, I've been working on voter protection issues for 5 presidential cycles now. There are just a lot of problems that are not solvable on election day. And there are a lot of things for which the fix is to actually be worried about it well in advance. So, with something like poll worker shortages, we can solve this if we actually focus on it in May. We cannot solve it if we focus on it in October. And that's very much true of some of these legislative fixes. If we're going to have fixes in place for November or even for September, even at the breakneck speed of the kind of legislation that we saw, for instance, with the recent legislative package that moved, or some of the stuff that's happening in Congress, you still need to fix it right now if you want to have any hope of solving the problems.
No, that's an excellent point. Reminds me of one question that I had earlier is, are there any states that are currently doing a really good job at this, whether they were doing a good job before with general elections work? Like, as Massachusetts is thinking about what to do, are there any states worth emulating? Or is nobody doing that great of a job?
I mean, there certainly are states that have been ahead of us on a number of the key reforms that I think are showing success now, right? So there have been vote by mail efforts successfully implemented in a number of Western states that have shown really good efficacy in terms of increasing access to the polls. We've definitely seen election day registration work in a lot of places. We've seen automatic voter registration of the more fulsome form that we all want to see happen in a lot of states. And I think that, Massachusetts is a leader in so many things and is not a leader in elections. And I think that we should be pushing our legislature, we should be pushing our statewide officials to be more progressive on election issues, and that extends to registration, that extends to early vote, and that extends to what we do on election day itself. And then as activists, we should all be thinking, what is the role that we want to play in each election? And I would encourage people not to think of that as, what am I going to do on election day? I would encourage people to think of that as, how are we going to get involved in campaigns and causes and election administration over the next 6 months? Because this is, I know it's cliche to talk about something being the most important election of a lifetime, but I mean, I think that there's real danger to our democracy in the sort of twin disasters of this pandemic and Donald Trump. And I think that if we do not invest our energy and our resources into making sure that people can register, vote, and have their votes count, we're going to really regret that in terms of our democracy. So I think now is the time to get invested.
Yeah, I second both of the points that you made around, maybe a good state would be looking at like Colorado, that seems to have kind of everything when it comes to automatic voter registration and vote by mail and whatnot. But I think a lot of our takeaway is just realizing how no matter what reform we're looking at, maybe with the exception of automatic voter registration, and there are some wins that Massachusetts has had around democracy reform, but just seeing that we really are not a leader yet, and we should be, because we have been on so many issues. And then the other point you made is that this really is a today problem. I think that one of the challenges that we've faced recently has been, again, and this is kind of like a crisis management issue, is in a moment when people are out of work, out of not either able to pay rent or whatever, and people are getting sick. How do we talk about something that feels kind of far away? And also, how do we talk about it in a way that's just not more bad news? Nobody wants to think that we're going to be in shelter in place or whatever our equivalent is come November. But I think what you're saying is just underscoring that the stakes of assuming that best case or better case scenario happens are way too high, and that if we wait until that moment, whether it's this summer or later, when we know how things will look in September or November, that will be far too late to get any of the things done that we need the legislature to get done and that we need to be doing on our end.
Yeah, that's all right, and I totally agree. I would hold up as an example potentially Oregon as early to AVR, early to vote by mail, and it shows how having enlightened election administrators can make a difference. Kate Brown was an excellent Secretary of State, and in Michigan, Jocelyn Benson is doing a lot of really important work and actually being proactive about reaching out to communities that have been traditionally excluded on election day and from registration. That matters, I think.
Yeah, I know, like, just thinking in terms of this is legislative action. Virginia just passed a number of election reforms. I think was it like last week where their governor signed them. So I believe they should now have election day registration, which we still don't have. One thing that I was like pointing out is that New Hampshire has had it for decades, and Maine has had it for decades, and Vermont has had it more recently, Connecticut more recently. The fact that states had election day registration in the 1970s means that it's not something that's particularly like technologically difficult to implement, so that there's kind of no excuse not to do it. Because kind of the corollary to that point is that one thing that's always somewhat ironic to me is that in Massachusetts, we might be seeing, like say in other states, where they roll back, where a state tries to weaken its election day registration or weaken its very long early voting window. And we here in Massachusetts are rightfully appalled by those conservative governors in those other states rolling back voting rights. But we haven't even gotten those in our own like self-identified very liberal state already. That shows that gap of kind of the need to make sure that we're actually improving things here as well as fighting to protect things around the country. On that point, we briefly brought up the issue of what Congress needs to do. Can we say like what needs to happen on the federal level? Like kind of as we're kind of wrapping up, what needs to happen on the federal level to make sure that we can have kind of a high turnout, kind of fully safe and like public health approved election?
I mean, I think there are probably a number of other answers to this question, but I think just the starting place is we need more money. It's great that the first CARES Act allocated $400 million to states. We got about, or are qualified for about $8 million. But the Brennan Center and a number of other organizations have showed that $2 billion is really what is needed to prepare elections across the board for the reality of the coronavirus. You know, I am hopeful that we will get another bite at the apple, but I'm not sure. But I mean, you know, and I think maybe this, one of the places where I also want to give elections administrators and town clerks and everybody who actually facilitates our elections some credit is, and you know, they run our elections, they deserve a lot of credit, but you know, these reforms will take work and they will take resources, and we are talking about, you know, some towns that don't have necessarily a whole lot to begin with. And you know, this year I worked at the polls, so it was my first time. It was such a long shift. It was great. I was the youngest person by like 40 years. But you know, I, for the first time, really appreciated that we have this clunky system of checkout for voters. So I was talking to different people who are working at the polls and the commissioner, and one of the things we were talking about is where would a registration table actually physically go? And who would work it? There was a shortage of poll workers in the first place. And all of that does, to a degree, tie back to funding. And so, you know, I think the other, that is what I see when you say federal government. I think money. And I also think that there is kind of a more like, kind of moral takeaway is we need to be better funding our elections, period. Because these issues should not keep common sense reforms from being passed in a state like Massachusetts.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kristina has this right, but you know, I mean, Congress is broken, right? We're lucky that we have a delegation that's going to fight for more money. The feds should pay for more money. We need that to implement something like vote by mail, although we can come up with the resources ourselves here in Massachusetts. But I mean, the executive branch is run by a tyrant who is weaponizing lies about voter fraud to put obstacles up against voters, who is, you know, is inciting voter suppression efforts all across the country. And the reality is that the struggle to promote voting rights is going to happen across 50 states and across an enormous number of counties. And you know, the way that we administer elections in this country is very idiosyncratic to the local communities. And Massachusetts is not ahead in terms of our own laws and election administration, but we don't have anywhere near the kinds of overt voter suppression that we see in states across the country. So the organization that I chair, the Voter Protection Corps, you know, looks at a lot of very places where we see suppression, where we see lack of resources leading to obstacles that face voters. And, you know, you see 4-hour long lines. We saw even in the primary lines of 4 or 5 hours. You see voter purges that are very intentionally trying to reduce participation. You see polling place closures that are pretextual in order to make it harder for African Americans to get to the polling locations they used to be able to go to. You see people micro-targeting vulnerable communities, trying to convince students they're not allowed to vote, and if they do, they'll go to jail. And so, you know, I think if you're talking about the federal landscape, you're talking about a situation where, unfortunately, the voter suppressors are in the Oval Office, right? The West Wing has been taken over, the RNC has been taken over by people who want to raise these kinds of obstacles. So, you know, it's a really difficult landscape out there.
Patrick, anything you want to chime in on this?
No, I think that's right. Look, I mean, we need the money. The only thing I think that could even stand any chance of getting through right now is more money. I think the Wyden and Klobuchar bill had provisions that would have required states to actually do something affirmative around remote voting options, which would be great. But I just think that's a non-starter. I mean, it'd be wonderful to have some kind of federal directive to force states to come up to a certain level, but I just don't see it. I mean, the biggest the thing that they could do is right now it's a little wonky, but the money that went out the door through the last bill has a matching thing. So state legislatures have to chip in a lot too. Like Massachusetts is going to be north of $1 million for us to access that money. I think they can retroactively. I think they could cut that out. They could take that provision out and just say that this is actually just a grant. You don't need to match, which would be great because state legislature. I mean, there's no revenue anymore. Like there's no money for this kind of stuff. So that could be. It's a technical change. It could actually be meaningful. That could actually make that money available to states instead of being kind of illusory as it is right now.
Right. So since I don't want to hold people too much past an hour, I'll do kind of right now as we wrap up, parting words that each person here wants to give to people who are watching right now or watching later about what needs to happen and what they can do to help make it happen.
Well, I'll start since I won first in the first round. So first of all, this is great. Thank you for hosting. This is really fun. I'm glad we could do this and hope we could do more. Obviously, I wish the circumstances were better. Yeah, I mean, I just emphasize the urgency, particularly focusing on Massachusetts. Like what Quentin and Kristina said is really right. I think what we've done so far is just a little bit of a Band-Aid to get us through the next few months. And it's short-term thinking. People need to understand the urgency of protecting vote on September 1st, particular, and then potentially November as well. And that's a project that should have started 2 weeks ago. Like we're late to the game on it, and we need to make sure we're thinking about it. And in this Commonwealth, it doesn't happen unless people who watch Progressive Massachusetts live streams on a Monday night, like put their effort into it and can't show up anymore. But we got to figure out how to get through to folks and make sure that this remains priority. I mean, don't want to have to go back to court again. so that's my one takeaway. I mean, we'll figure it out. We're in a good place. It's not like some of these states it's actually a mendacious attempt to undermine people, but it won't happen unless we all work for it.
Kristina?
Yeah, no, I mean, I second also Patrick's. Thanks for having us. This has been a lot of fun. And now is the time for people to be calling their legislators about this stuff. I think that particularly, it's always hard to move an issue up legislators' list of priorities. I think that's probably especially so in a crisis. And we have a challenge right now around making it clear that something that is months away needs action now. So my ask is call your legislators, urge them to be looking to the fall elections and support all of the different reforms that we've talked about, even, pick one, vote by mail, election day registration. I also, if for young people look into becoming a poll worker, I think that it's a different kind of civic duty in this moment. And it's also a great way of learning about our elections.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. I mean, I think that we've seen how effective the Progressive Mass group can be when it focuses on some of these issues. We just saw how effective Common Cause and some of its allies were enforcing the issue on this. And so I think we need to be really clear about picking a couple of things and really pushing for them. And if that were me at this moment, I would say, I think vote by mail and something like the piece of legislation that Becca Rausch and Adrian Madero just filed is a doable thing. I think we should push for that. I think that we should also be pushing for election day registration. I think that that is something whose time has come. And where we need a piece of legislation to get over the finish line on that. I do think that we should fix this AVR problem. I think that when the legislature passed it and when a lot of us pushed for it, we thought we were pushing for a form of automatic voter registration that is different from how we're seeing it. And I think a lot of people are going to get disenfranchised as a result of the difference between having election day registration and meaningful automatic voter registration and not. But I think we should be picking picking a few things and a narrow window and then focusing a lot of attention and energy on making it very hard for legislators to forget that those are important issues to be done now.
Awesome. Then before I give some parting words to Zelda, if people want to learn more about the work of Common Cause or the Voter Protection Corps, where should they go?
So the Voter Protection Corps is voter-protection.org, and we'd love to get you involved.
And Common Cause is commoncause.org/MA.
Awesome. And then say, Zelda, any parting comments that you want to give?
I would first like to make sure that I wish a very happy belated birthday to both Anna and Max Palfrey. That's pretty exciting, Quentin, that you get to do a double on that day.
Thank you,
Thank you guys, everyone, like Kristina and Patrick. This was like so informative and I really appreciate it. And also everyone who's watching or listening, whatever, join Progressive Mass because they will help you figure out what you need to be doing anything exciting right now that's helping move forward our causes. That's what I did, and I'm having a great time.
Awesome. And so just as a quick plug, we have a page on our website with a number of bills, including the vote by mail bills discussed. It's progressivemass.com/COVID_response. But I want to thank my co-host Zelda, and I want to thank Quentin, Kristina, and Patrick for joining this evening. And thank you to everybody who's watching now or will be watching later. And then I am stopping the live stream in